Friendship is supposed to mean loyalty, trust, and safety. But what happens when the very people you let into your life, the ones you laugh with, share secrets with, and call family, turn out to be your executioners? These 6 killers weren't strangers lurking in alleys or monsters hiding behind masks. They were friends, chosen, trusted, welcomed, who used that closeness as the perfect cover for betrayal. Some killed over jealousy, others over money, and some simply because friendship gave them access to their victims' lives. The result? Murders so shocking they rattled entire communities because no one expected the killer to be the person sitting across the dinner table. These are the 6 killers who chose their friends. And each story proves that the most dangerous predator isn't always the stranger outside. Sometimes it's the one who knows where you live, what you fear, and when you're most vulnerable. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, do you believe a true friend would never turn? Or does every friendship carry a shadow of risk? And don't forget to subscribe, because what you're about to hear will make you question the meaning of the word friend. Friendship can survive arguments, distance, even betrayal. But sometimes money becomes the poison that rots it from the inside. In a small Illinois town in the late 1990s, 2 men who had grown up together, laughing on the same playgrounds and attending the same schools, would see their bond unravel in blood. Their names were Daniel Reeves and Mark Hollis, and for nearly 20 years they had been inseparable. They fished together, worked side by side in construction, even served as best men at each other's weddings. Neighbors said they were closer than brothers, the kind of pair you couldn't imagine apart. But in 1998, when Daniel lost his job and borrowed several $1,000s from Mark, something shifted. At first, Mark lent him the money willingly, confident his lifelong friend would pay him back. Weeks turned into months, months into a year, and the debt remained unpaid. Mark pressed gently at first, then more urgently. He had a family to support, bills piling up, and Daniel's excuses, car repairs, late checks, promises that never materialized, began to sound like lies. What once was laughter between friends became tense silences and strained conversations. And then, one night, Daniel made a decision that would shatter their history forever. If Mark wouldn't stop pressing him for the money, Daniel would silence him instead. He began planning in ways that didn't seem suspicious, still spending time with Mark as though nothing had changed. They played cards in the garage, shared beers after long days, and told stories about their childhood. But underneath Daniel's smile was calculation. He knew Mark's routines, when he left for work, when his wife and kids were gone, when he was most vulnerable. He knew where Mark kept his spare keys, where he left his tools, even how often he checked in with neighbors. And most importantly, he knew that Mark trusted him completely, trusted him enough to open the door without hesitation, even at odd hours. Daniel used that trust as his weapon. One evening, after Mark mentioned again the unpaid debt and suggested, "It's time we settled this," Daniel saw the final straw snap inside himself. He masked his rage with a laugh, but in his mind, the decision had been made. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about pride, about not wanting to be looked at as weak, as someone who owed another man. To Daniel, killing Mark became less about debt and more about reclaiming power. He began setting his trap, buying the weapon that wouldn't immediately raise alarms. A simple hammer, the kind Mark himself used in his garage every day. Daniel lured Mark with the simplest bait of all, friendship. He suggested a late-night beer at Mark's garage, something they'd done countless times before. Mark, ever trusting, agreed without hesitation. As they sat surrounded by tools and the smell of oil and wood, Daniel waited. He let Mark talk, let him joke, let him bring up the debt again in passing, a half smile on his face. That was the moment Daniel chose. He excused himself to grab another beer, his hand closing around the hammer he had hidden behind a toolbox earlier that day. When he returned, he swung with sudden, brutal force, the weight of their 20-year friendship crashing down in the blow. Mark's laughter turned to shock, then to silence as Daniel struck again. By the time the echo faded, the garage that had once been their shared space of laughter had become a crime scene, and the man Daniel once called brother lay lifeless at his feet. Daniel's hands trembled, not from regret, but from adrenaline. He whispered to himself, "Debt settled," as though the murder had erased not only the money owed, but the bond they once shared. When the final blow landed and Mark's body lay still on the cold garage floor, Daniel Reeves's adrenaline shifted from rage to panic. The reality of what he had done began to settle in, not regret, but the weight of logistics. Killing Mark was only half the battle. Now he had to erase the crime. His first instinct was to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He rifled through Mark's wallet, snatching a few bills and scattering tools across the garage to mimic a struggle. But even as he staged the scene, Daniel knew the police would see through the clumsy attempt unless he controlled every detail. He dragged Mark's body across the concrete, the scrape of boots leaving faint streaks that he later tried to mop away with rags and cleaning fluid. Then he stuffed the lifeless body into a tarp he had stashed in his truck, a precaution he had justified to himself as just in case. That phrase, just in case, would later echo through investigators' minds as proof that this wasn't a crime of sudden passion, but a premeditated execution. He drove for nearly an hour outside town, choosing back roads no one used at night. The weight of the body in the truck bed felt heavier than the years of friendship he had carried, heavier than the debt that had pushed him to this point. Finally, he stopped near an abandoned quarry, a place they had once visited as teenagers, skipping rocks into the dark water. That twisted symmetry wasn't lost on him. Using ropes and stones, he weighted the tarp and rolled Mark's body into the blackness. The splash was loud, echoing off the quarry walls before fading into silence. Daniel stood there for several minutes, staring at the ripples, convincing himself it was done, that the water would erase everything. But what he couldn't erase were the small mistakes. A neighbor who had seen his truck near Mark's garage, a smear of blood he missed beneath a workbench. The fact that Mark's wife knew he had planned to have a beer with Daniel that night. These loose threads would begin to unravel faster than he anticipated. In the days that followed, Daniel played his part as the concerned friend. When Mark's wife reported him missing, Daniel was among the first to help search. He joined neighbors combing streets, knocked on doors, even comforted Mark's children with false reassurances. "Your dad probably just needed some air." But detectives quickly noted his eagerness, how he seemed too involved, too insistent on steering the search away from the garage. A sweep of the property revealed faint traces of blood on the concrete floor despite Daniel's cleaning. When luminol testing was applied, the garage lit up with evidence of the struggle he thought he had hidden. Even more damning was a hammer, hastily scrubbed but still carrying microscopic blood traces, tucked behind the same toolbox Daniel had retrieved it from that night. And when detectives questioned Mark's wife, she recounted how her husband had left that evening saying, "Daniel invited me over for a drink." The noose of suspicion tightened almost immediately. What Daniel believed was the perfect cover was crumbling under the weight of overlooked details. The interrogation of Daniel Reeves began like countless others, a detective across the table, a recorder humming softly, and the silence of a man who thought he could still talk his way out. At first, Daniel stuck to his story. He told police that yes, he and Mark were close, that yes, they sometimes had beers together, but that night Mark had left him early, claiming he was tired. He insisted he went home, watched television, and fell asleep. But detectives already had more than enough to poke holes in his account. They confronted him with the neighbor's statement, the one who saw Daniel's truck parked near the garage late into the night. They showed him the luminol photographs, the garage glowing with splatters invisible to the naked eye. They slid the blood-stained hammer across the table, the tool Mark's wife confirmed he had bought years ago, now tainted with DNA. With each piece of evidence, Daniel's calm facade cracked. He shifted in his chair, rubbed his face, and muttered half-denials, but never outright confessed. His silence only deepened the suspicion that investigators already knew. Daniel had killed the man he once called brother over nothing more than money and pride. The trial was swift and brutal. Prosecutors painted Daniel as a man so consumed by debt and humiliation that he turned to murder as a solution. They laid out the evidence in painstaking detail: the hammer, the blood in the garage, the neighbor's testimony, and finally, the discovery of Mark's body weeks later, dragged from the quarry waters by divers. The tarp, the ropes, even the stones he had chosen to weigh it down were presented to the jury, each item a reminder of his cold planning. Mark's wife took the stand, her voice breaking as she described how her husband had trusted Daniel implicitly, how he had walked out that night with no fear, no suspicion, only to be betrayed by the man he considered family. The defense tried to argue it was a crime of passion, a sudden argument that spiraled out of control. But the evidence of premeditation, the purchased hammer, the tarp, the calculated disposal, destroyed that narrative. When the jury returned a guilty verdict for first-degree murder, Daniel showed no emotion. He stared ahead as the judge sentenced him to life without parole, the courtroom filled with sobs from the family of the man he had killed. For investigators, the case became a grim reminder of how trust can be weaponized. The betrayal of friendship cut deeper than any stranger's attack because it came from someone invited into the heart of a man's life. Neighbors who once waved at Daniel across the fence now crossed the street to avoid even the mention of his name. And as the prison gates closed behind him, the story of Daniel Reeves served as a chilling introduction to this truth. Sometimes the friend you choose can become the friend who ends you. Daniel's betrayal was born from debt and pride, but the next killer's story carried an even darker edge, because for him, murder wasn't about money. It was about jealousy, and the kind of envy that grows quietly in the heart of a so-called best friend until it finally explodes in blood. Jealousy is a poison that seeps slowly, often unnoticed, until it corrodes everything it touches. For Matthew Crane, that poison festered for years, hidden behind the smile he wore whenever he stood beside his best friend, Alex Monroe. The two had been inseparable since high school, teammates on the same basketball squad, roommates in college, groomsmen at each other's weddings. Everyone in their small Pennsylvania town saw them as brothers, and in many ways they were. But what no one saw was the imbalance. Alex was the golden boy, charming, successful, married to a woman everyone adored, the father of 2 children who idolized him. Matthew, by contrast, was the shadow, the one who struggled with jobs, who drifted in and out of relationships, who always seemed to stand just one step behind. He laughed off the comparisons, pretended he was proud, but inside, a bitter envy gnawed at him. Each promotion Alex received, each new success, felt like a blade twisting deeper into Matthew's pride. And though Alex never mocked him, never flaunted his good fortune, Matthew's mind twisted friendship into competition. By 2003, that competition had grown into obsession, and in his obsession, Matthew began to fantasize about erasing the man he could never measure up to. The seed of murder was planted in the smallest of moments. An evening at Alex's home, where Matthew sat at the dinner table watching the ease of his friend's life. The warmth of the house, the laughter of children, the way Alex's wife leaned against him with casual intimacy, it all burned Matthew from the inside. Later that night, as he drove home alone to his empty apartment, he clenched the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Why him? Why not me? That refrain echoed in his head until jealousy no longer felt like emotion, but like a mandate. Over the next weeks, his envy metastasized into planning. He studied Alex's routines the way one studies prey: what time he left for work, when he jogged in the evenings, when his wife was out shopping. Friendship gave him access no stranger could have had. He knew the back door was rarely locked, knew where Alex kept his spare keys, knew the blind spots in the yard where neighbors couldn't see. And the weapon he chose wasn't flashy or complicated. It was a kitchen knife taken from his own drawer, sharpened to a fine edge. He justified the simplicity with a thought that would later chill investigators: it should be personal. It has to be personal. Matthew chose his night carefully. He knew Alex's wife would be out late at a church meeting, and the children would be asleep upstairs. As the sun went down, Matthew parked 2 blocks away and walked silently toward the house of the man who had once been his anchor. He let himself in through the back door, as he had countless times before, only this time his footsteps carried death. Alex was in the kitchen, sorting through bills, a beer resting by his elbow. He looked up, surprised but unalarmed, to see his old friend. "Matt, what are you doing here this late?" he asked casually, unaware that the answer was already in Matthew's hand. The jealousy that had grown for years surged in that moment, a tidal wave of bitterness disguised as loyalty, and Matthew stepped forward, raising the blade with hands that had once clasped Alex's in friendship. What happened next would leave a community stunned, because no one imagined betrayal could cut this deep, or this literally. The knife came down in a blur of motion, the betrayal as sudden as it was brutal. Alex barely had time to register shock before the first stab sank deep into his chest. He gasped, eyes wide with disbelief, not at the pain, but at the face of the man holding the weapon. "Matt." He tried to speak, but the second strike silenced him, slicing through the air with the finality of years of hidden jealousy erupting into violence. Matthew stabbed again and again, each thrust less about killing and more about releasing years of resentment, years of being second best. The kitchen that had once been filled with laughter and family warmth now echoed with the sound of struggle, the thud of bodies against tile, the metallic tang of blood filling the room. By the time Matthew stopped, Alex lay motionless on the floor, the man he had once called brother reduced to a lifeless body at his feet. For a moment, Matthew simply stood there, chest heaving, staring at the blood on his hands as if finally realizing what envy had driven him to. But instead of regret, what washed over him was relief, a sick, hollow satisfaction that the shadow he had lived under was finally gone. But satisfaction quickly gave way to fear. Matthew knew he couldn't just leave the scene as it was. He dragged Alex's body across the kitchen floor, smearing blood in streaks he later tried to mop away with towels. He rifled through drawers, scattering papers, pulling open cabinets to stage the appearance of a burglary. He even took Alex's wallet and a few electronics, hoping investigators would see the crime as a robbery gone wrong rather than the targeted betrayal it truly was. Yet even as he staged the scene, he overlooked small but damning details. His fingerprints were everywhere, not just in the kitchen but on the beer bottle he had touched when he first arrived, on the back door handle he had let himself in with, on the knife itself. Worse still, he hadn't considered the children asleep upstairs. Though they hadn't witnessed the murder, Alex's young son later told police he had woken briefly and heard Uncle Matt's voice downstairs before the yelling began. It was a detail that would later tear apart Matthew's flimsy cover story. In the hours after the murder, Matthew returned home and tried to act as though nothing had happened. He burned his blood-stained clothes in a metal drum behind his apartment building, scrubbing his hands raw in the sink. When news broke the next day that Alex had been found murdered by his wife, Matthew showed up at the house with tears in his eyes, hugging her, insisting, "We'll get through this together." Neighbors thought it was touching that Alex's best friend was so supportive, but detectives were already circling. They noticed how Matthew inserted himself into the investigation, constantly offering theories, even volunteering to help search for suspects. It was the same mistake so many killers make, trying too hard to look innocent. Combined with the son's memory of his voice and the lack of forced entry, suspicion quickly narrowed. What Matthew thought was a perfect crime was already unraveling, and the truth, that envy had turned a friend into a murderer, was about to surface with devastating clarity. Detectives didn't wait long to bring Matthew Crane in for questioning. From the start, he played the role of the grieving friend, slumping in his chair, wiping fake tears, and insisting he would do anything to help. But the moment investigators began presenting evidence, the facade crumbled. They showed him photographs of the bloody footprints in Alex's kitchen, prints that matched the exact size of Matthew's boots. They asked why Alex's son remembered his voice that night. They slid across the table the beer bottle lifted for fingerprints, which bore his smudged prints despite his claim that he hadn't been there in days. And finally, they laid down the kitchen knife, the blade swabbed for blood and the handle bearing his DNA. Each piece of evidence was a nail in his coffin, and though he never admitted guilt outright, his silence and shifting explanations spoke louder than any confession could. Within hours, Matthew was charged with first-degree murder, the betrayal so shocking that even seasoned officers said they had never seen envy twist so deeply into violence. The trial drew massive attention, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the intimacy of the betrayal. Prosecutors didn't just argue murder, they painted a portrait of jealousy eating a man alive until it destroyed the very friendship that defined him. They played recordings of Matthew's interrogation, where his voice cracked under pressure, and they called Alex's wife to the stand to describe how Matthew had hugged her the very morning after the murder, feigning comfort while the blood of her husband was still under his fingernails. The defense tried to spin the case as a burglary gone wrong, suggesting Matthew had been framed or had stumbled onto the scene after Alex's death, but the evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, DNA, the lack of forced entry, and most importantly, the testimony of Alex's son who had recognized his voice all pointed to one truth. Alex's killer was the man he trusted most. When the guilty verdict was read, Matthew sat motionless, eyes hollow, as though envy had already burned everything inside him to ash. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his name forever etched in the town's memory as the friend who killed not for survival, not for rage, but for jealousy. For Alex's family, the betrayal cut deeper than the murder itself. They hadn't just lost a husband, a father, a brother. They had lost trust in the very idea of friendship. The image of Matthew sitting at their dinner table, smiling, laughing, pretending, would haunt them longer than any trial transcript. For investigators, it was a reminder that the line between loyalty and betrayal can be paper thin, and that sometimes the person closest to you is the one holding the knife. Matthew's betrayal ended with jealousy, but the next killer's story unfolded in an even colder way, because for him, murder wasn't about money or envy. It was about betrayal of a secret and silencing a friend who knew too much. Secrets bind friends together, sometimes forever, sometimes fatally. In rural Kentucky, two men carried one secret too many, and it ended with one burying the other in a shallow grave. Jeremy Walsh and Tyler Briggs had been friends since middle school, the kind of kids who skipped class together, stole beers from convenience stores, and swore loyalty under the bleachers. By their 20s, that loyalty had turned into something darker. Both had flirted with small-time crime, shoplifting, stolen car parts, and later dealing pills in their tight-knit community. For years, it was just a way to make cash, nothing that drew much attention. But in 2005, when a police sting operation began sweeping through the county, the pressure mounted. Tyler was arrested briefly, questioned, and then released. Rumors spread quickly. Had he talked? Jeremy demanded answers, but Tyler swore he had said nothing. Jeremy pretended to believe him, but doubt took root like rot in his chest. Every glance, every hesitation, every nervous laugh Tyler gave became, in Jeremy's mind, confirmation that his friend had betrayed him. And if Tyler had talked once, Jeremy feared, he might talk again. The paranoia grew unbearable. Jeremy replayed every memory of their friendship through a darker lens. The secret stashes of cash Tyler knew about. The location of a car they had stripped together and abandoned in the woods. The names of buyers who trusted them both. To Jeremy, Tyler wasn't just a friend anymore. He was a liability, a ticking time bomb in human form. Killing him became, in Jeremy's warped logic, an act of self-preservation. He rationalized it as taking care of business, even though deep down it was fear driving his thoughts. What made it easier was how much access friendship gave him. Tyler trusted him completely, still believing the bond they had formed as boys was unbreakable. When Jeremy suggested a weekend camping trip, something they had done many times before, Tyler agreed without hesitation, packing beers, fishing rods, and sleeping bags, never suspecting that his best friend had packed something else entirely, a shovel, duct tape, and his father's hunting rifle. They drove out to an isolated clearing they had visited years earlier, a place where teenage versions of themselves had built fires and talked about their futures. Tyler saw it as nostalgia, a chance to escape the stress of town. Jeremy saw it as the perfect stage for betrayal. That night, as the fire crackled and beers were drained, Jeremy's paranoia reached a boiling point. Tyler laughed about old times, completely unaware of the storm brewing across from him. Finally, Jeremy stood, rifle in hand, and confronted him with the question that had consumed him for weeks. "Who did you tell?" Tyler, confused, denied everything, his voice cracking as panic set in. But Jeremy wasn't listening. The bond of loyalty they had sworn to years earlier shattered in an instant as Jeremy raised the rifle and pulled the trigger, silencing forever the friend who had once been his brother in all but blood. The gunshot echoed through the woods, startling owls from the trees and leaving a heavy silence Jeremy Walsh would never forget. Tyler Briggs fell backward onto the dirt, his eyes wide with shock, the firelight flickering across his face one last time. For a moment, Jeremy stood frozen, the rifle shaking in his hands, as though the reality of what he had done hadn't fully reached him. Then the urgency of self-preservation kicked in. He dropped the rifle, dragged Tyler's body toward the shallow pit he had dug earlier in the day under the pretense of preparing a fire ring, and realized the soil wasn't deep enough to hide what he had just done. Panicked, he spent hours clawing at the ground with the shovel, sweat mixing with blood, until the pit was large enough to conceal his lifelong friend. He wrapped Tyler's body in a tarp, duct-taped it tightly, and lowered it into the grave, piling dirt and leaves on top until the clearing looked untouched. To complete the illusion of a camping trip, Jeremy scattered beer cans, tossed fish hooks into the fire, and left Tyler's backpack half open near the trees. By morning, the scene looked like a night that had ended in nothing more than drunken chaos. When Jeremy returned to town, he rehearsed his story. He told Tyler's girlfriend that Tyler had decided to head out early from the trip after they argued about money, and that Jeremy had stayed behind to clean up camp. He spoke casually, even laughed in places, making it sound like a minor falling out between friends. For a few days, people believed him. Tyler had been known to disappear for short stretches before, especially when he needed space. But this time was different. His truck was still parked outside his house. His phone went dead. His family filed a missing persons report within a week, and suddenly Jeremy found himself at the center of an investigation. Detectives asked the obvious question: why had Jeremy been the last to see him? Jeremy stuck to his script, insisting Tyler had left camp angry and stormed off, perhaps hitching a ride. Yet the cracks began to show almost immediately. Police scoured the clearing where Jeremy claimed they had camped, and what they found contradicted his version. The disturbed soil, though covered with leaves, raised suspicions. Dogs brought to the scene alerted near the fire pit, their noses catching traces of human remains even through the thin layer of earth. Detectives also noticed inconsistencies in Jeremy's timeline. His claim of packing up camp the next morning clashed with tire tracks, showing he had left the woods long before dawn. Even his behavior drew suspicion. He inserted himself into the search parties, offering theories about where Tyler might have gone, volunteering details no one had asked for. His eagerness, his rehearsed lines, and the way his eyes darted when investigators pressed him all painted a picture of guilt. For the first time since pulling the trigger, Jeremy felt the noose of suspicion tightening, and he realized burying his best friend's body had not buried the truth. The discovery of Tyler Briggs's body came just 2 weeks after he vanished. Search dogs returned to the campsite where Jeremy Walsh claimed they had spent the weekend, circling frantically near the fire pit. Investigators dug into the disturbed soil and within hours unearthed the tarp-wrapped remains of the man Jeremy had once called his brother. The evidence was as damning as it was gruesome. Duct tape wound tightly around Tyler's torso, a bullet wound in his chest, and the shovel Jeremy had left behind, its handle still bearing his fingerprints. From that moment, the missing person case became a homicide, and Jeremy became the only suspect. Detectives arrested him at his apartment, where they found Tyler's hunting knife and a bundle of his fishing gear stuffed under the bed. Faced with the mounting evidence, Jeremy clung to denial, insisting the camping trip had ended with an argument and that Tyler must have been killed by someone else after storming off. But his words sounded hollow when compared to the facts. The trial laid bare the betrayal in excruciating detail. Prosecutors argued that Jeremy's motive was fear that Tyler had or would expose their shared crimes, fear that his closest friend had become a liability. They presented the rifle, tied ballistically to the bullet pulled from Tyler's chest, and they presented the duct tape, matched to a roll found in Jeremy's garage. They showed the jury Jeremy's bank records, revealing that just days before the murder he had withdrawn cash to purchase supplies: rope, tarps, ammunition. Witnesses testified about his paranoia in the weeks leading up to Tyler's disappearance, how he had accused his best friend of talking too much. The most chilling testimony came from Tyler's girlfriend, who recalled Jeremy assuring her, with cold eyes, that Tyler had just needed space. Those words, spoken while Tyler's body was already buried in the woods, convinced the jury of his guilt as much as any forensic evidence could. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. Jeremy was sentenced to life without parole, a punishment the judge described as fitting for the betrayal of a brotherhood that should have lasted a lifetime. For the community, the case was more than just another homicide. It was a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust. Parents who had once let their children roam freely with friends now looked twice at who was coming into their homes. Old friends exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if loyalty ever truly guaranteed safety. And for investigators, the haunting part wasn't just the crime itself. It was the reminder that secrets, when shared between friends, can become weapons as sharp as any knife or as final as any bullet. Jeremy silenced Tyler because of secrets. But the next killer's betrayal came from something even colder. Because when opportunity collided with greed, one woman discovered that killing her closest friend could buy her the life she thought she deserved. Greed has a way of warping loyalty into opportunity, and for Jessica Lange, friendship became nothing more than a stepping stone to wealth. She and Rachel Porter had been best friends since high school, two girls who stuck together through heartbreaks, bad jobs, and new marriages. They were so close that people in their North Carolina town joked they were sisters in everything but blood. Jessica was the dreamer, always chasing schemes that promised quick money, while Rachel was the steady one, cautious, reliable, the kind of friend who covered bills when Jessica came up short. Their bond seemed unshakable until Rachel's grandmother died, leaving her a sizable inheritance. It was more money than either of them had ever seen, and Jessica couldn't stop thinking about it. The jealousy was immediate, but unlike Matthew Crane's envy of Alex, Jessica's feelings weren't rooted in comparison. They were rooted in hunger. She didn't just want what Rachel had, she wanted all of it. And slowly, the thought took root. The fastest way to get her hands on the inheritance was to remove Rachel from the picture entirely. Jessica began planting the seeds of her plan under the guise of friendship. She offered to help Rachel manage her inheritance, pretending to be the wise, street-smart friend who could protect her from being taken advantage of. Rachel, ever trusting, agreed. Jessica learned everything: where Rachel kept her money, what accounts she used, even her schedule of deposits. But knowledge wasn't enough. She needed opportunity, and friendship gave her that too. Rachel often invited Jessica over for dinner or late-night wine talks, the kind of casual visits where trust erased suspicion. Jessica studied the house during those evenings, noting which windows were easiest to unlock, which rooms stayed dark, and how Rachel's new alarm system often went unused because she thought her neighborhood was safe. All of it became part of Jessica's mental map for murder. The weapon Jessica chose was as intimate as the betrayal itself. She bought a bottle of wine, Rachel's favorite brand, and laced it with a lethal dose of liquid sedative stolen from a veterinary clinic where Jessica's cousin worked. On the night she decided to act, she showed up at Rachel's house smiling, the bottle tucked under her arm, just another casual evening between best friends. Rachel greeted her with laughter, pouring the wine into 2 glasses, completely unaware that every sip was pulling her closer to death. Jessica watched as her friend grew drowsy, her words slurring, her eyelids heavy. When Rachel finally collapsed on the couch, Jessica didn't hesitate. She pressed a pillow over her best friend's face, holding it down until the body stopped struggling. The room was silent again, but everything had changed. Jessica had crossed the line between friend and predator, all for the promise of money. When Rachel Porter's body went still beneath the pillow, Jessica Lange sat frozen for a long moment, listening to the silence of the house. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a clock on the wall, and the shallow rattle of her own breath were the only sounds. She had killed her best friend, but in Jessica's mind, the act was just the beginning. Now came the part she thought would be easy, erasing the crime. She poured the remaining wine into the sink, rinsed the glasses, and tucked the bottle into her purse to dispose of later. She carefully arranged the pillow to make it look like Rachel had fallen asleep on the couch, her body angled as though she had simply drifted away. Jessica then opened Rachel's purse, slipping out her checkbook, ID, and bank documents, stuffing them into her own bag. The plan was simple. Make the death look natural, then quietly siphon money from Rachel's accounts over the next few weeks. She convinced herself no one would question it. Rachel had a history of anxiety, and Jessica hoped whispers of stress or heart failure would explain away the sudden loss. But Rachel's family knew her too well. When they found her body the next morning, her sister immediately questioned the scene. Rachel never left wine glasses unwashed, never slept on the couch without her blanket, never went to bed without locking the doors. The inconsistencies gnawed at her sister, who pressed police to dig deeper. Autopsy results revealed high levels of sedatives in Rachel's blood, a substance she had no prescription for. Investigators immediately flagged the death as suspicious. Jessica's attempt to hide her tracks began to unravel almost instantly. Bank records showed that within days of Rachel's death, someone had attempted to access her accounts online using Rachel's login details, and the IP address traced back to Jessica's apartment. Detectives also learned that Jessica had recently been spotted buying expensive clothes and electronics, purchases that didn't match her modest salary. The appearance of sudden wealth made her an obvious target for questioning. When detectives interviewed Jessica, she leaned heavily on her role as Rachel's best friend. She cried, told stories of their shared childhood, and insisted she was devastated by the loss. But investigators noted how her tears seemed rehearsed, how her answers about the night before were too polished. They pressed her on details. What wine had they drunk? What time had she left? Why hadn't she called Rachel the next morning? Jessica stumbled over her words, then shifted blame, suggesting maybe Rachel had overdosed accidentally. But her calm faltered when detectives asked why Rachel's bank login had been used from her home. She denied it, then grew defensive, then abruptly ended the interview. To investigators, her behavior was as incriminating as any fingerprint. What Jessica had underestimated was that greed doesn't just demand the crime, it leaves fingerprints in every withdrawal, every lie, every purchase made with stolen money. Her hunger for Rachel's inheritance had pushed her to murder, but it was the trail of greed that would lead straight back to her door. The unraveling of Jessica Lane's scheme came faster than she ever imagined. Within 3 weeks of Rachel Porter's death, investigators had compiled a mountain of circumstantial evidence that all pointed in her direction. Surveillance cameras showed Jessica withdrawing cash from an ATM using Rachel's card the very night after she died. Bank records revealed multiple login attempts from Jessica's apartment computer, each one stopped by incorrect password entries before she finally reset access with information she had stolen from Rachel's purse. Even more damning was the bottle of wine investigators found in a dumpster near Jessica's home. Shards of glass still coated with traces of sedative. The lab confirmed the chemical matched the same drug discovered in Rachel's blood. That single discovery tied Jessica to the crime in a way no performance of grief could erase. When detectives arrived at her door with a warrant, they found receipts for luxury items purchased days after Rachel's death, along with Rachel's checkbook hidden in a shoebox. She was arrested on the spot, her calm mask finally cracking as she screamed at officers that it wasn't supposed to go like this. The trial was a public spectacle. Prosecutors painted Jessica as a woman consumed by greed, someone willing to destroy a 20-year friendship for money she hadn't earned. They called Rachel's sister to the stand, who tearfully described the inconsistencies at the crime scene and her immediate suspicion. They presented the toxicology reports, the bank login records, and the wine bottle evidence, each piece weaving a story of betrayal as intimate as it was ruthless. The jury listened as forensic experts explained how Rachel's death couldn't have been natural. The sedatives in her system were too concentrated, administered deliberately. When prosecutors revealed Jessica's recent purchases, from expensive electronics to designer clothes, the jury audibly gasped. The motive was as clear as the method. The defense tried to argue circumstantial evidence, suggesting Rachel could have accidentally ingested the drugs, that Jessica was merely sloppy in handling finances after her friend's death. But the weight of evidence crushed those arguments. The verdict was inevitable. Jessica was found guilty of first-degree murder and financial fraud, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Rachel's family, the pain was doubled. Not only had they lost a daughter and sister, but the loss came at the hands of the person she trusted most. The betrayal left scars that no conviction could heal. For the town, the case became a cautionary tale whispered in grocery stores and churches. Beware the friend who seems too interested in your fortune, because greed can turn loyalty into a weapon sharper than any blade. Jessica's crime was driven by money, but the next betrayal came from something far more personal, because the next killer wasn't after wealth. He killed his friend for love, twisting affection into a reason for murder. Love can bond people together, but it can also drive them to betray everything sacred. In Ohio, 2007, a tragedy unfolded that proved how affection twisted into obsession could turn a friend into a killer. Evan Marsh and Dylan Carter had been friends since middle school, the kind of boys who spent weekends playing video games, riding bikes, and dreaming about the future. By their late 20s, their bond seemed unshakable. They shared an apartment briefly, worked construction jobs together, and even dated within the same social circle. But when Dylan fell in love with Claire Simmons, a woman Evan had secretly adored for years, the friendship cracked in ways no one around them could see. Evan had always been quiet about his feelings for Claire, always the supportive friend who gave advice and encouragement when Dylan asked about her. But inside, bitterness churned. He watched their relationship blossom, watched Dylan get engaged, and all the while convinced himself that Claire should have been his. The thought became an obsession. If he couldn't have her, no one could. Evan's fixation deepened with every wedding plan Dylan and Claire announced. He smiled when Dylan asked him to be best man, but beneath the grin, he was seething. He imagined himself standing at the altar in Dylan's place, imagined Claire's hand in his, imagined a life where his best friend wasn't the barrier to his happiness. That envy metastasized into resentment, then into planning. Evan knew Dylan's routines better than anyone. When he left the construction site, when he went to Claire's apartment, when he jogged through the park after work. Friendship gave him access no stranger could have had. Evan began toying with the idea of removing Dylan entirely, telling himself it would be an accident, that no one would ever suspect him. What began as fantasy hardened into a plan. He would wait for the night Dylan jogged alone, the one habit Evan himself had encouraged, and he would end it there. The weapon Evan chose was chilling in its simplicity, a crowbar taken from their shared job site. On a late summer evening, he drove to the park where Dylan jogged, hiding in the shadows of an underpass. When Dylan appeared, earbuds in, sweat glistening under the streetlights, Evan stepped out as if to greet him. Dylan's face lit up in recognition, but before a word left his mouth, the crowbar came crashing down. The first strike shattered bone, the second dropped him to the ground, and the third ended the life of the man Evan had once called brother. Dylan's blood spread across the concrete, pooling beneath his running shoes, while Evan stood trembling, not with horror, but with the grim certainty that he had just removed the obstacle between himself and Claire. In that moment, he convinced himself he had acted out of love. But in truth, he had destroyed everything: his friend, his future, and any chance at the love he thought he deserved. The moment Dylan's body went still beneath the crowbar, Evan Marsh's obsession shifted from fantasy to survival. He stood under the dim light of the underpass, staring at the blood pooling across the concrete, realizing he had crossed the line from longing friend to cold-blooded killer. His first instinct was to stage the scene, to make it look like random violence. He pulled Dylan's wallet from his pocket, scattering cash on the ground before taking the rest, hoping it would look like a mugging gone wrong. He ripped Dylan's earbuds from his ears, tossing them into the bushes, and dragged the crowbar into the shadows where it wouldn't immediately be found. But as he worked, he overlooked the details that would later betray him. The distinct tread of his work boots pressed into the blood, the way his fingerprints lingered on Dylan's phone, and most of all, the fact that he was the only one who knew Dylan's jogging schedule so precisely. For a moment he told himself the staging was enough, that police would chalk it up to another senseless street crime. He left Dylan's body under the bridge, wiped his hands on his jeans, and drove home, convinced he had fooled everyone. The next morning, Dylan's body was discovered by a cyclist, and the shock rippled instantly through their community. Claire Simmons collapsed when police arrived at her apartment, sobbing uncontrollably as she clutched the engagement ring Dylan had given her just weeks earlier. Friends and neighbors spoke of Dylan as the man who had everything ahead of him, the man everyone liked, the man who didn't deserve such a brutal end. Evan was among the first to console Claire, wrapping his arms around her and whispering that he'd make sure justice was served. To outsiders, his support looked like the behavior of a grieving best man stepping into his role as protector. But to investigators, his eagerness to involve himself was unsettling. Evan attended every vigil, spoke to every detective, and even began driving Claire to police interviews, his presence constant and suffocating. The problem for him was that grief sharpened Claire's instincts. In her haze of mourning, she remembered how Evan had always looked at her just a second too long, how his jokes about, "If Dylan ever messed up, I'd take my shot," didn't seem like jokes anymore. And when detectives asked about Dylan's habits, she offhandedly mentioned, "Only Evan knew his jogging routine that well." That single comment turned the investigation toward him. Detectives began piecing together the puzzle. Security cameras near the park caught the faint image of a vehicle matching Evan's parked 2 blocks away on the night of the murder. Boot prints at the crime scene matched the distinctive tread of construction boots issued at their job site, boots Evan wore daily. Forensic testing revealed Dylan's blood embedded in the grooves of a pair of jeans Evan had hastily washed, but not thoroughly enough. Even his attempts to portray the crime as a mugging backfired when detectives found cash still scattered near Dylan's body, something no real mugger would have left behind. The final straw came when investigators uncovered internet searches on Evan's computer about how to stage robberies and blunt force trauma survival times. To detectives, it was no longer just a case of random street violence. It was personal, targeted, and almost certainly committed by someone who knew Dylan intimately. That someone was Evan, the man who stood at Claire's side pretending to share her grief while secretly craving her love. The illusion of innocence was collapsing, and Evan's carefully constructed lie was about to implode under the weight of evidence. Evan Marsh's arrest came one chilly October morning, less than a month after Dylan Carter's murder. Detectives arrived at his apartment with a warrant, finding him groggy, still in the work boots that had sealed his fate. Inside his closet, they discovered the crowbar, hastily wiped down but still bearing flecks of Dylan's blood and tissue under the handle. When confronted, Evan tried to feign confusion, claiming he had lent the tool to Dylan weeks earlier. But the story fell apart when investigators presented the surveillance footage of his car near the park and the cell tower data placing his phone within a half-mile of the crime scene at the exact time of the murder. Evan's face drained of color as the weight of his lies collapsed. Though he never confessed, his silence became louder than words. The trial was devastating for Claire Simmons, who not only had to relive the murder of her fiancé, but also hear how his so-called best friend had killed him in the name of twisted love. Prosecutors laid out the story with brutal clarity. Evan's long-hidden obsession, his jealousy, the calculated ambush with the crowbar, and the clumsy attempt to stage the killing as a robbery. They presented the internet searches, the boot prints, the blood evidence, and even Evan's erratic behavior at vigils, where he positioned himself as Claire's protector. Witnesses testified about how Evan had always seemed too close, how he once joked, "If Dylan weren't around, Claire would be mine." In the courtroom, those words turned from an offhand comment into a motive soaked in blood. The defense tried to frame the crime as random violence, suggesting Evan's proximity was coincidence. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through every excuse, every denial, every attempt to paint Evan as a grieving friend rather than a calculating killer. The verdict was guilty on all counts: first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Evan was sentenced to life in prison without parole. When given the chance to speak, he finally addressed Claire, his voice trembling as he whispered, "It should have been me." The courtroom erupted in gasps, Claire burying her face in her hands as the full horror of his obsession was laid bare. For the community, the betrayal cut deep, a reminder that love, when twisted by envy, can turn friendship into a weapon as lethal as any gun or blade. Evan's story became the cautionary tale parents told their children. Sometimes the friend you trust most hides feelings darker than you can imagine. Evan's betrayal ended in prison walls, but the next killer's story is perhaps the most disturbing of them all. Because unlike him, she didn't kill for money, envy, or love. She killed her friend for fun, treating murder as a game no one else realized they were playing. Some killers are driven by greed, others by jealousy, rage, or even misguided love. But the most chilling motive of all is no motive at all, just the thrill of killing. In 2012, in a quiet Colorado suburb, that's exactly what happened when 22-year-old Marissa Hale turned on her closest friend, Jenna Wright, for no reason other than curiosity. The two women had been inseparable since high school. They were the kind of pair everyone envied, finishing each other's sentences, sharing clothes, traveling together, and posting endless photos of their nights out. To outsiders, their friendship was enviable, even unbreakable. But beneath Marissa's bright smile was a fascination she had never shared with anyone, an obsession with death. She spent hours reading about serial killers online, scouring forums about unsolved murders, and even collecting crime magazines that she hid in boxes under her bed. To her, death wasn't just frightening, it was exciting. And the one question that gnawed at her day after day was simple and horrifying. What would it feel like to take a life myself? Friendship gave her the perfect opportunity. Jenna trusted her completely. She often joked that Marissa was her second half, the one she told everything to, her fears, her secrets, her dreams. Marissa took note of all of it, cataloging not just the details of Jenna's life, but the vulnerabilities that made her easy prey. Jenna had recently broken up with her boyfriend and confided in Marissa that she felt lonely at night, scared in her empty apartment. Marissa encouraged her to invite her over whenever she felt uneasy, cultivating an excuse to be there at the exact moment she wanted to strike. For weeks, she toyed with the idea, sharpening it in her mind like a blade, imagining different methods: poison, suffocation, stabbing, until she finally decided that stabbing would give her the intimacy she craved. It would let her feel the act in real time, the control over life and death in her own hands. To prepare, she bought a hunting knife from a local outdoor shop, telling the clerk it was for camping. In reality, it was for a night Jenna never saw coming. That night came on a rainy October evening. Jenna had called Marissa to come over for a movie night, saying she didn't want to be alone with the storm pounding outside. Marissa showed up with snacks, a smile, and the knife hidden in her bag. They curled up on the couch under blankets, laughing at bad horror movies, drinking wine, the way they had done countless times before. To Jenna, it was comfort. To Marissa, it was the setup to her twisted experiment. As the rain lashed against the windows, Marissa excused herself to the bathroom, gripping the knife tightly in her hand as she returned. She stood behind the couch for a moment, staring down at the girl she called her best friend, her pulse racing with anticipation. Then, in one sudden motion, she lunged. The blade plunged into Jenna's back, her scream drowned out by thunder outside. Marissa stabbed again and again, each thrust feeding the dark curiosity that had consumed her for years. By the time Jenna collapsed on the floor, the movie still playing in the background, Marissa's obsession had transformed into reality. She stood over the body, trembling not with fear or regret, but with exhilaration. In her journal later, she would write, "Now I know what it feels like." As Jenna Wright's body lay cooling on the floor, blood soaking into the carpet beneath her, Marissa Hale's pulse slowed from frantic excitement to cold calculation. The thrill of killing was still buzzing in her chest, but now she faced the reality of what came next. She had to hide what she'd done. She dragged Jenna's lifeless body into the bedroom, smearing crimson streaks along the hallway walls as she went. She tried to wipe them away with towels, but every swipe only made the stains worse. In her panic, she forgot one of the first lessons she had read about in her countless hours of studying true crime. Killers always leave a trail. Marissa rummaged through Jenna's dresser, pulling out clothes to cover the body, then rifled through drawers for anything valuable she could take to stage the scene as a burglary. She pocketed a few pieces of jewelry, stuffed cash from Jenna's wallet into her bag, and then smashed a window from the inside with a lamp to make it look like someone had broken in. To her, it seemed convincing enough. To investigators, it would later look exactly like what it was: staged. Marissa left Jenna's apartment around midnight, pulling her hood up against the storm and carrying the hunting knife wrapped in a plastic bag. She tossed the bag into a dumpster several blocks away, believing the rain would wash away any trace of evidence. What she didn't notice was the trail of muddy footprints she left behind, footprints that matched the tread of her favorite sneakers. She drove home, stripped her bloody clothes, and stuffed them into a garbage bag that she hid in her closet, too afraid to throw them out immediately. Then she sat at her desk, adrenaline still coursing through her, and opened her journal. In messy handwriting she scrawled, "It's real now. The blood, the fear, the silence. I finally did it." She fell asleep with the notebook still open, unaware that it would later be one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her. When Jenna's body was discovered the next morning by her landlord, who had grown suspicious after hearing her TV blaring through the night, shock tore through the community. Police were called immediately, and the crime scene spoke louder than words. The smashed window showed no glass outside, only inside, a clear sign the break-in was staged. The scattered jewelry box looked wrong, too deliberate, too theatrical. But the most glaring red flag came from the trail of footprints leading from the bedroom to the front door. Investigators quickly noted that they were small, likely belonging to a woman. Neighbors reported seeing Marissa's car parked outside Jenna's apartment the night before. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The two were inseparable, their friendship admired by everyone. But as detectives interviewed Marissa, her rehearsed grief cracked. She wept too easily, offered details no one had asked for, and stumbled when asked about her whereabouts after leaving Jenna's apartment. Most suspicious of all, she had no explanation for why her fingerprints were on the broken lamp used to stage the window. The mask of the best friend in mourning was slipping, and investigators began circling her with the same precision she once admired in the cases she studied. The investigation into Jenna Wright's murder unraveled Marissa Hale's life faster than she could invent new lies. Detectives brought her back for questioning after forensic testing confirmed the footprints at the scene matched the tread of sneakers they had already seen her wear in public. They pressed harder, asking why she had been near Jenna's apartment that night when neighbors reported her car parked outside. Marissa tried to play the part of the grieving friend again, tears spilling as she insisted she had left long before Jenna was killed. But when detectives revealed that her fingerprints were all over the broken lamp and shards of glass from the staged window, her voice faltered. The final blow came when investigators obtained a warrant to search her apartment. Inside her closet, tucked behind old jackets, they found the garbage bag of blood-stained clothing she had been too afraid to dispose of. Tests confirmed the blood belonged to Jenna. Even worse, hidden under her mattress was the journal where she had written, in her own hand, a confession disguised as reflection. "I finally did it. Now I know what it feels like." That single line was enough to end any pretense of innocence. Marissa was arrested on the spot, her hands cuffed while she stared blankly ahead, the same emptiness in her eyes that once concealed her obsession. Her trial captivated the public, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the motive, or lack of one. Prosecutors told the story of a young woman who had killed not for money, not for jealousy, not for love, but for curiosity. They presented her journal entries, the staged crime scene, the bloody clothes, and the murder weapon recovered from a dumpster after being traced through surveillance footage. Forensic experts explained how Jenna's wounds were consistent with a frenzied stabbing, not a burglary gone wrong. Witnesses testified about Marissa's lifelong fascination with true crime, how she often joked about wanting to know what it feels like, jokes that no one had ever taken seriously until it was too late. The defense tried to argue insanity, painting Marissa as a disturbed young woman driven by obsession rather than malice. But the jury was unmoved. Her writings proved intent, her staging proved planning, and the sheer coldness of killing her best friend eliminated sympathy. When the guilty verdict was read, first-degree murder, life without parole, Marissa showed no emotion. She stood silent, eyes forward, as though the verdict confirmed what she already knew. She had chosen this path the moment she picked up that knife. For Jenna's family, the pain was unbearable. They had trusted Marissa as one of their own, invited her into their home, treated her like family. To learn she had betrayed that trust for nothing more than the thrill was a wound deeper than any blade could carve. The community, too, was shaken. Friendship, once considered a safe bond, now carried a shadow of suspicion. Parents told their children, "Be careful who you call your best friend." 6 killers, 6 friendships turned fatal. Debt, jealousy, secrets, greed, love, and thrill. Each one a different mask for the same truth. The most dangerous predator is not always the stranger in the dark. Sometimes it's the person sitting beside you, the friend you chose, the one who knows your weaknesses better than anyone else. Because trust, once broken, doesn't just kill the body, it murders the very idea of safety.